Welcome to Redirect Immigration Law and Perspectives, a weekly dive into the world of immigration law and its human consequences. I'm here with Matthew Archambault.
Woohoo! How you doing, Stephen?
Co-host, fellow immigration attorney in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I'm doing good. We're going to be talking to Jessica Goudeau. She's the author of After the Last Border. It's a really interesting book. Talk a little bit about the book. You've been reading it.
Yeah, so it's about a refugee resettlement program that has been going pretty good in this country since about 1980. It gives a historical perspective on the program and on our relationship with accepting refugees from our inception as a country. And as you read the book, you'll see that we've kind of gone back and forth on our willingness to accept refugees. People are always shocked to find out that we turned away Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany back in the late 30s and sent them back to basically be put into concentration camps and killed. And people are often like, wow, how would we do that as a country? We're much better than that. So Jessica does a good job in taking you through a historical perspective till today, where as a country, we're doing the same thing to the refugees now that we did back in the late 30s. So there is going to be a time frame, hopefully there's a time frame in our country where people look back and say, wow, they were really heartless, and I can't believe our country was as immoral as they were under the Trump administration with refugees. Hopefully they're saying that in the future, and they're not saying, wow, Trump had it right, because that's a really dark turn for this country. But she tells the story not only from a historical perspective, but through refugees, Hasna and Muna. Hasna is from Syria, who's a recent refugee, and Muna is from Burma, and she has been in the country for, I think, 15 or 16 years and has settled here. And the point that she wanted to tell with these individuals as refugees is what happens to life after the last border being here in the United States, because so many refugees have crossed many borders before they're accepted in the refugee program.
So it's a story of refugees getting Obama phones and just living the high life on food stamps and our generous public
this is
benefit
really
system.
interesting that you say that, because we talked briefly about it, but I'm watching The Handmaid's Tale currently. And people haven't seen The Handmaid's Tale. It's the United States is overthrown by this like Christian conservative sect, and it turns into this dystopian nightmare especially for women who are subjugated and forced into servitude to become handmaids, their job is to have babies for their masters, and then their babies are taken away from them. And children are being separated. So there are a lot of parallels to what's going on right now. But one scene is there are some people who, one of the main characters, escapes to Canada as a refugee. And as she's lying shivering, the Border Patrol agent from Canada wraps her in a blanket and says, "Are you fearful of being persecuted for being a woman in Gilead," which is the name of the new nation? "And do you seek protection from the Canadian government?" And she says, yes. And then, we can only dream that our Border Patrol worked that way. And then another scene is when they're processing refugees, and they're Americans, right? They're American citizens, and they look a lot like me and Steven, and they were professional.
Just hot.
Normal
sexy,
dudes and gals.
hot,
sexy people.
Incredible bodies.
Exactly.
Chiseled features.
Yes. And they're like going in, and they're given this one, her name's Mara, she's given a plastic bag, and then it has a cell phone so she can communicate. And they're like, within your cell phone, you have $400 of prepaid minutes, and there's $500 in cash for you, and there's a card and coupons and all these things that people think people get when they cross our border,
Right.
And you're there, and you're feeling you're so happy that this person was able to escape this horrible situation that she was in. You're like, oh my God, she's welcomed, and here's this lifeline that she's going to be given to be able to start anew. And it really makes you feel good. And then you, as practitioners, we understand that this does not happen here.
Yeah. My clients have never gotten such a kit.
No. Well, I mean, when they have better lawyers like me, that's when that happens.
Oh yeah, you're supposed to file a 1-page application for it.
Yeah, well, it's been up to like 4 pages now, but bureaucracy.
Right.
But anyways, the book does a really good job at having you look at how we treat refugees here in the U.S. And Jessica, we had a great conversation. I think people will enjoy it, and they should buy the book. Just buy a book, read a book.
For sure. And I do think, a lot of times, this is 2 authors in a row who have, I think, good, accessible books. And this one is more of a narration, I think, in some ways, stories of real people. And we talked about this last week, but it's so important for folks to have these stories in their lives, if not personally with the neighbor or the owner of the restaurant that they like to go to or whatever, then through these types of narrations. And so if you're sympathetic to immigrants, you should read it. And if you know somebody in your life who's on the fence about things or maybe, apathetic or whatever, I would definitely recommend gifting it to those types of folks because we just need more exposure of these types of stories.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about before we throw the interview?
There's so much to talk about. We just go down a rabbit hole of
QAnon.
It's going to be interesting the next couple months, right? Because I think what you see with Trump now is he's trying to throw out different narratives to see which one works. And right now, I think a couple of narratives he likes is that Biden is senile, doesn't know where he's at, the mental acuity. I guess he gave a good speech last night. I have no interest in watching political speeches, so I don't know. But then you see like the unrest in our cities and cities like Portland and Chicago and whatnot and Minneapolis. He's going to play that up to big, scary urban centers, which is, I think someone said it's no longer a dog whistle for racism. It's like a bullhorn.
Mm-hmm.
And I expect that we'll get a good amount of anti-immigrant screeds coming soon. But, I just remembered Steve Bannon got arrested.
I was waiting for you to shut up so we can talk about Steve Bannon.
And if they can arrest Chris Kobach, I will smile for probably a week.
I don't know that 2020 is redeemable. I mean, it's certainly not with 180,000 dead in our country alone from this horrible disease. But
Steve Bannon
there's a few things. There's a few things that could happen that, again, it's not even tipping the scales. It's just straight to the veins. It feels good. That's all I've got to say. But I do think the Bannon thing is just pure crystallized Trumpism. It just shows what a perfect grift all of this stuff is. I mean, the fact that
people aren't following it was that build a private wall thing that they were basically GoFundMe raising money for, and they're just like grifting the whole thing. But the wall, right, is a grift, right? That is the perfect grift that he used to become president because it's not real. And Mexico's not paying for it.
Those people don't give a about building the wall. They got a bunch of money from probably mostly elderly folks or people who were whipped into a frenzy about it. First of all, Mexico is supposed to pay for it. So there's that.
Yeah,
but then
they got a lot of money from people that have economic anxiety.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. A bunch of economically anxious people donated their hard-earned dollars to this thing only to have it be spent on, watches and boats and like that in violation of any number of laws, a bunch of different laws. And you see, it's not like this was some fringe project. I mean, the president's kids were promoting it. The president himself supposedly was back.
The Border Patrol person mentioned that at a press conference with Chad Wolf there, and how they were all supporting it.
Yeah.
I mean, the president is obviously going to do is like, I don't know who these people are. I had nothing to do. I didn't think it was a good idea. But it's going to work. Trust me, that's going to work for enough of his supporters.
Oh, yeah. I mean, nobody's eyes are being opened by this, but I will say this. My prediction, I want this to be recorded for posterity. I just read that the Trump campaign has spent over $1 billion so far in their reelection efforts, shattering a record. I think at this point, the Obama administration had spent something like $600 million. So they're almost twice the previous record. And we're going to find out at a certain point, and this isn't exactly a Nostradamus moment, but that almost all of that money is just straight up being vacuumed into the pockets of Trump himself, his stupid kids and their families, his resorts. I mean, it's just the whole thing.
Who was the guy he got demoted? The guy who was running the campaign?
His campaign manager, yeah.
I mean,
I don't remember his name.
Look, and I hate saying, I mean, I'm sure there's an element of that, right? In most big campaigns, people are going to grift and take, but I imagine that this is probably at a site that's going to be unprecedented. And, what's there to spend $1 billion on? And most of their ads are on Facebook and YouTube and all that, which doesn't cost a lot of money, but
right.
Hey, you know what? I mean, I haven't given them any money, so it ain't my money. How about you, Stephen? How much have you given?
Well, it hasn't been a lot, but anyways, well, listen, let's go to the interview. Matthew, it's good talking to you, and we'll do this again next week.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, we're really happy to have Jessica Goudeau on the show today. She's the author of After the Last Border, Two Families and the Story of Refuge in America. And that book is out now.
Yeah, it came out on August 4th.
People can buy it. Where should they buy it?
So I'm a big fan of buying it from your local independent bookseller because I think that they could all use the love in these hard times. But it's available everywhere from Barnes & Noble to Target.
You can buy it right on your iBooks app.
But the point is this, guys. There's lots of ways to buy the book. And for people who maybe need an introduction, they can listen to this podcast, obviously. But you also wrote an essay for the New York Times, which is a nice little intro, I think, to this issue. And it's good because I practice immigration law, and most of my clients are farm workers. They were farm workers in their countries, and then they came here and they're still farm workers. And many of them are seeking asylum, but refugees are something different. So I do think as a sort of baseline matter, we should distinguish the difference between asylum and refugees.
Yeah, I think what's so fascinating is so often we view them as different categories of people. And there is definite truth in the fact that these are very different visa categories. And it's really important to understand the differences between them. So you can become an economic migrant when you cross the border because you're seeking out financial reasons to help your family. I'm a big believer that there is no worthiness or lack of worthiness based on whether or not you have no jobs available to you, but it is a different way of coming into the country. Asylum seekers are people who are wanting to prove to either the US government or to UNHCR officials or other governments around the world that they need haven because they would be persecuted or killed for one of 5 different reasons that we've agreed on after World War II. There was an international consensus about what it means to be a refugee. So an asylum seeker is someone who's seeking out asylum. And then a refugee is someone who has proven that they would be, in fact, persecuted or killed. And so there are a variety of things that happen to refugees around the world, and a very tiny percentage of them are welcomed for resettlement in another country, not just the United States. And so my book is about the resettlement program, but I also am very aware of the fact that there are lots of people who are trying to make a better life for themselves or who are fleeing violence or conflict who may or may not fit into those exact categories.
Right. And I think we're going to talk about the ways in which the refugee resettlement program has been changed. Sort of the heart of your book and what this is all about is this idea that our posture towards refugees and refugee resettlement, it's sort of a bellwether of our country's moral center, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not I come from a religious background and, Jesus said, insofar as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me, right? So how we treat the people who have gone through the worst circumstances, who are in the most dire need, really is a reflection of our moral character. And so I think that that's really important. I thought about my mother, who's sort of a lifelong conservative, mostly apolitical, I think, most of her life, but she's so grossed out morally by Trump. And he made fun of the reporter, and he is sort of gross on the face, I think, is not a stretch to say. And yet I think she doesn't know anything about this particular issue. So talk about what has actually happened under this administration.
I think it is wider than one administration. And I think it's really important for us to notice that it's not as if it's one person who is doing this. In fact, anti-refugee rhetoric began before Trump even was running for office. There were some echoes of it in early 2015. It really solidified around the Paris attacks that were happening in Europe in 2015. And it hit the fears that are happening in Europe and in the United States, as well as the spread of misinformation using memes and other things on Facebook and other social media. And it just took off in part because there had not been a lot of arguments for refugee resettlement over the 40 years since the Refugee Act was passed in 1980. So refugee resettlement, it passed unanimously in the Senate. It had overwhelming support in the House of Representatives and has always been a staunch bipartisan program. George H.W. Bush resettled more refugees than any other president in the 40 years of the program. And even after 9/11, George W. Bush only reduced the incoming admissions process to 70,000. And so just recognizing that this has always been something that we have recognized across the political aisle from very different faiths, people who don't have faith, people who believe all kinds of different things have always recognized that this was a part of our country that really shows the best parts of ourselves, what we do to help people who are the most vulnerable in the world. And so what happened in 2015 and 2016 was a real aberration for the support that we've always had for refugee resettlement. And that was something that the Trump administration really picked up. And they have brought the entire program really to the edge of collapse in a way that is absolutely unprecedented. And I'm afraid most people don't even recognize how dire things have become.
So, Jessica, I just wanted to jump in because I actually have been reading your book, and I encourage everyone who cares about this issue, or if you don't care about this issue, maybe even more important to read the book. Now, I haven't been able to read the whole thing because I'm kind of a nerd. I was reading a lot about...
He's not a strong reader.
But throughout the book, you talk about the history of U.S. refugee resettlement and maybe kind of the tortured history that this country has with it. So you mentioned that in 1980, we passed the Refugee Resettlement Act, and it's been going pretty good until recently. But over the history of this country, I'm wondering, is the time period from 1980 to just recently, what is more of an aberration, that our country is willing to accept refugees or its willingness to refuse to accept refugees? Because we don't have a great history. Back in World War II, we refused dock into the St. Louis that had all these refugees coming from Europe, Jewish refugees. And it just seems like throughout our history, we've gone through periods where we've been not willing to accept refugees, not willing to accept the lesser amongst us, as Stephen said. So is our willingness to accept refugees that we've had recently, is that an aberration, or is what's happening now under Trump an aberration?
So I would say both. And I think that it's actually critically important to notice that the back and forth is the history that I tried to tell. So as I was beginning the research for the ways that the U.S. has resettled refugees, I'm not a policy person. I come to refugee resettlement through my relationships. Muna, who is the woman whose story I write about first, and then Hasna, who came over from Syria. Those are the two people that I knew. I met Muna 13 years ago when I was translating Spanish for a healthcare initiative at a community center. And so because I came to this as someone who has a PhD in poetry and who thinks more about writing than I might have thought about history, I really wanted to find the story of resettlement, that this was not just, this is not a policy book. This is really the story of our country's coming of age in some ways. And I found that actually to be really a fascinating thing. I thought that I would go in and research laws. And what I went in and found was that it had significantly more to do with our own country's shifts and our identity. How we viewed ourselves had a lot more to do with how we resettled people than, who was president or what was happening in the Congress at the time. And so I actually think that that's a really important piece, because we are a country that is in constant flux, that is often, there's a push and pull over what it means to be America. This is not the America I know, or this is America and we're, define ourselves in these ways. And as we look at people that come to this country, whether we view ourselves as quote unquote a nation of immigrants, or the kind of place that really welcomes newcomers, or, a place that is threatened and needs to be made great again, those debates about identity slice through the lives of real people that need safety and haven. And I think we often don't recognize that our words have consequences on a national scale, right? And so understanding that the policies that were put in place for Cubans coming over who fit into our understanding of what it meant to be a refugee more than Haitians, the Cubans have almost always enjoyed a much more welcome reception here in the United States than Haitians, who were also fleeing oppression and also fleeing corruption, and yet do not have the same kind of acts. And so refugee resettlement until 1980 was a series of ad hoc policies based on what was popular at the time. And so after World War II, we had a real shift in our country from not wanting to hear at all about what was happening in the Holocaust to recognizing that we needed to lead the way in providing haven for the millions of refugees that were in Europe. And that's how the beginning of the actual refugee resettlement program happened, but it wasn't solidified until 1980. And I think the last few years have really revealed to us that there is a lot of work to be done in this program, that we need to make this a more established program that can't be threatened by one president's xenophobic feelings.
I do like the one part that I think kind of draws a direct line from what you're talking about, what happened after World War II, is I guess there was a sentiment back in 1939 when the MS St. Louis was refused to allow to unload refugees here back in 1939, a sentiment of better safe than sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're seeing that now. Like someone like Stephen's mom, who has a great moral compass, there are a lot of those people, those types of people who are saying, wow, what's really happening in Syria and around the world, it's really terrible. I feel bad for those people, but better safe than sorry. I'm not saying Stephen's mom is saying that, but I think there are a lot of good, decent people who have that thing. And it does come from misinformation and xenophobia and all that. So talk about what we're seeing now with how the refugee program is being dismantled.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I will say too, the better safe than sorryism, that's such an academic move to add an ism to any phrase. But I feel like that's really something that we don't even recognize as being a rhetorical move that happens for a lot of us in Facebook posts. So I
like to call it better safe than sorry gate.
Okay, sure.
I'm more into politics than academia. So.
We can either have an ism or a gate, either one, right? That's good. I actually had a relative on Facebook who kept posting that. Well, I know you know a lot of refugees and you really want to bring them over, but I think it's better for us to be safe than sorry. And she's a person, like Stephen's mom, that I think has a clear moral center and is a really, in my experience, a very good person that genuinely is very thoughtful and engages with the world in, really intentional ways. So it was not only surprising, but kind of personally hurtful to me to keep having those conversations. And when I was going back and doing my research, I saw how often advocates in the late 1930s and early 1940s kept trying to push Americans to really pay attention to what was happening to their family members in Poland. And they kept coming up with that kind of response. Oh man, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. But, better safe than sorry. And I actually want to push back, if it's okay, a little bit on some of the language of the least of these. I also grew up in a religious background. And I think that so often that phrase is used to view people who are in situations like refugees or people who are immigrating to the United States. And there is a slight edge of privileging of some people over others. And I think if we're viewing refugees only by the circumstances under which they have to flee their countries, then it's easy to see them as victims. And in fact, that's part of why I tried to tell the book in the way that I did. I wanted these to be stories centered on two women who had lives that were interrupted by circumstances, just like many of us are having lives interrupted by the pandemic or have had about other things. And so these are just people who are very similar in a lot of ways to me and to others. And I think that's the key to getting past the better safe than sorryism, is recognizing the shared humanity that we have and the fact that we would make exactly the same choices. If our children were starving or if our children were being threatened by missiles, of course we would flee. And then of course we would try to find safety for them. And I think recognizing that shared space is kind of the first empathetic step that we make towards understanding what it means to be a refugee.
Right. I'm not saying that that's my preferred way of framing it necessarily. And I do think
that was Stephen who had said that.
Yeah, I totally knew.
I agree. That was a bad point, Matthew, from earlier. No, but I do think it's so true that so often immigration law, they're explicitly trying to move to what they call a merits-based system. But in many ways, that's what already exists. And we're sort of almost reflexively trained to rank people based on their skills or their circumstances, or we get this a lot with our clients where it's like, well, a cartel took over your town and murdered a bunch of people, but you weren't directly threatened. So, you have a crappy claim. And you're right. What we should be doing is stepping back and just seeing people as people. So yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it's important to always keep that in mind, I think.
And to be clear, I didn't think that you were saying the least of these as if that was the term.
Jessica, you know what? If you want to fight about it. No,
yeah. I think it's important for us to notice that even the ways that are well-intentioned, that sometimes we reduce people to less than themselves.
Well, I mean, it is true, though, when we're doing our asylum claims and a lot of the stuff we do, sometimes you almost have to play that up. And it sometimes you put yourself in kind of an uncomfortable role. And it is a great point. And unfortunately, I've been watching The Handmaid's Tale, which is amazing. And I'm having nightmares. But it deals with American citizens, us privileged people becoming refugees in Canada. And it's such an amazing perspective to see, what if it was us? And I think people like me and Stephen who deal with it every day, we are able to have empathy because, our clients bring in their children, see that. And hopefully it's easy for us that work in the field to see it. Sometimes it's hard to translate. And that's why the book's important to those personal stories that, okay, one, these are kind of normal people, right? While they're extraordinary people in their own right, they're not more extraordinary than most people if they find themselves in that situation. So I am enjoying the personal story from Hasnan and Muna that you put in there.
Yeah. What was so fascinating to me when I was in the process, so I did these interviews over 2 years, every 2 weeks. This was an incredibly intense process, in part because I have a background in issues of representation and know how often we come with a preconceived set of ideas of what it means to be a refugee or what it means to be someone who has these stories. And you will find so many books that are they had this sensational journey where they crossed an ocean or a desert, and then they were saved by Western countries, and then everything was wonderful. And I really wanted to start this book at the end of that story in some ways and make that the beginning. So after the last border, after they crossed, I wanted to push back against a lot of those stereotypes. And as I was listening to their stories, though it is a story about two women who were former refugees, really not a story of being a refugee. I watched The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel when it came out, and it was in the process of moving from interviews to writing the book. And as I was watching it, I thought, this is exactly the same kind of story in a very different context, a very different time period, a rich woman in the 1950s who's kind of coming of age and finding herself. And it's so fascinating to me how there are, thousands of stories like that. And the circumstances might be totally different. But for me, this is a story of two women who found out that they were strong and overcame a lot of really complicated things in order to try to root themselves and their families in a new place. And it is just a really different feel, I think, than what I expected to write and then what most people think when they write a book.
I mean, your point is that you found strength in these women, right? And that I think the strength is really kind of within more of us than we would want to know or that we know, and that they're not really unlike us, right? Or unlike some of the people that live here that would want to restrict them from being here in the United States.
Yeah. I have seen this so many times in my life. When you meet someone and you listen to their story, it is almost impossible not to be moved by the circumstances of what they've gone through and to want to do whatever you can to connect with them or to help them or to befriend them, right? And I think we see this in all kinds of people, whenever they know someone who's gone through a really hard thing. Like we do fundraisers for my friend who has cancer, and we help teachers who are in the middle of this really complicated situation. And I think the people that are often the staunchest anti-refugee people are also the people that the minute they meet someone, and I think this is true for a lot of immigration cases as well, the minute they meet someone are really moved by their story and want to connect with them. And I think part of what I was hoping in this book is to bring people into relationship in some way, even if it's just by reading a book with two women that I really love.
Yeah, that's a WG visa that people look for, the white guy visa. my guy, Jose, he's one of the good ones.
Mm-hmm. So that's right.
Yeah, you must be able to help him, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
by the authority vested in me as a white male, I would like to extend a visa to my landscaper who...
Yeah, he's not one of them.
He's not one of them. He's different. Yeah, this is a phenomenon that we talk about a lot on the show. But it's kind of clownish and we can make fun of those people, but that's often, I think, the first step to those people seeing, the broader community and understanding the issue with more clarity. Because oftentimes those people walk away from those consultations saying like, wow, I can't believe there's really no options for, this person who's totally deserving. So just real quick, talk about some of the specific things that have happened recently. I mean, I understand that we're a country capable of good things, like maybe what happened from 1980 to 2015, and bad things like what happened in 1939 and what's happening now. But what is the current state of things, and what are the specific changes that have happened to make life more difficult for refugees?
Yeah, I began interviewing Hasna in December 2016, right after the election. So she came over in July 2016 from Syria. The war in Syria just happened. The interview process with her was incredibly different from the interview process with Muna. Muna was 5 when she crossed her first border, and she saw a little bit of fighting, but it wasn't something that she lived through. For her, it was more about life in a camp in Thailand. And this is true for a lot of Burmese refugees. There was some conflict and then a lot of just several years of being stuck. For Hasna, who came over from Syria, the war began in her hometown. That's part of why I picked her to write this book, because her story, she was just a frontline witness to what was happening in Syria at the time. And I mean, it's been less than 10 years that she was living in one place and had this whole life ahead of her. And then everything has been so tragically upended, first by the government of Syria that was targeting people in her hometown, and then just by the failure of the resettlement process in the United States. And so I don't want to give the ending away too much, but her entire goal throughout the entire book is just to keep her kids and her grandkids safe. They all lived around her. She had a thriving community in her hometown. People have this misconception that refugees are like dying to get over to the United States. And Hasna only wants to go back home. And so just recognizing that that's something that our misconceptions are wrong about a lot of this. This book, when I started, I was a month into interviewing her when the Trump administration, on its first week in office, decided that everyone from Syria could not come over. And what happened next for her family members, for her kids and her grandkids, was really complicated. And so it is an ongoing situation. And we always think about this as if it's like removed from us. These are politics and this is an issue that happens to those people. And I really wanted this to feel so deeply personal so that by the time you got to the point in the book where this administration was making these choices, you were so heartbroken because Hasna at this point and her grandkids. I mean, I've seen so many pictures of her precious grandbabies that are still in danger around the world. And of course, she, as a former refugee who has received resettlement in the United States, is not grateful and living this new wonderful life because her family members are still in danger because of the Trump policies. So every year since Donald Trump has been in office, he has lowered the refugee resettlement ceiling by several thousand. And we're coming up in October. On October 1st is when the next presidential determination is due. And as he continues to gut resettlement, it's costing agencies, it's hurting refugees like Hasna. It's affecting other people who should be over here. This is not a program that can just start and stop on a dime. This is thousands of people working together collaboratively across all of these countries. And the damage to this program has been incredibly extensive. This is really the first time that any president has done anything like this in the history of resettlement since World War II. And I think a lot of us who really care about resettlement and who may not be the most political are recognizing that this election is really going to matter if we want to help refugees around the world.
Yeah.
So shouldn't we talk just a little bit about the dangers that refugees bring to the U.S.? And I'm saying this sarcastically because I want to give you an opportunity to maybe swat away this misconception that is out there. Because if you listen to the right-wing media and to Trump and people who support Trump, it's incredibly dangerous to bring in refugees because you don't know who they are.
I mean, you interviewed these ladies every 2 weeks for 2 years, but what if they're secret terrorists? Is what Matthew's trying to ask.
Yeah, and what if they bring over an ideology or a belief that's going to infect not only them, but their children and their community? This is the fear, right?
Yeah.
Even sent me a link to your op-ed in the New York Times, and he said, they're playing the long game. Because I'll let you finish why. Oh,
someone saying that refugees are playing the long game?
That was Stephen's joke.
Oh.
There hasn't been any, right? I mean, it's been 40 years and we haven't had any.
Yeah.
But, Stephen's point is they're just biding their time.
Yeah. For 85 years, they are waiting to get to the very, very long game. This is one of the dumbest arguments, frankly. Maybe you shouldn't include that part.
No,
this is.
No.
I mean, there are so many visa categories. It is so easy to come over to the United States as a tourist. Every tourist who has come over, as far as I know, has come over on a student visa or a tourist visa. The refugee resettlement program, and this is part of what I addressed in the book as well. It is such a hard-fought program between two different sides. The liberalizers that want to bring more newcomers in. And by the way, these were not partisan. I used restrictionists and liberalizers. These are historians' terms because Republicans were the great liberalizers early in the century and Democrats were the restrictionists. That unionized Democrats did not want more workers coming in and taking jobs. And so they were the ones that were really trying to push to close immigration. So we've had this fight, but the partisanship has really shifted over the last 100 years or more. And so just recognizing that there are a lot of ways for people to come into our country and do harm. There are also so many more people doing harm that are white men. And I don't know what it is that keeps us from understanding risk and having fear that matches that risk, if that makes sense. So we're not afraid of guns in schools, but we are afraid of refugees who go through an extensive years-long vetting process. The vast majority of people who want to resettle in the United States are turned away to our shame. There are a lot of incredibly wonderful, deserving people who just need a safe place, who will never find that opportunity. And so I'm one of those people that believes that we over-securitize the refugee resettlement program, not under-securitize. And it's just the fact that we didn't know about it that makes people think, we should definitely try to make sure that these people aren't, quote unquote, coming over here and going to do harm. I mean, this is several refugees who have been in this program and who have been in this process. It can take 5 years easily to begin to even think about coming to the United States. And now it's going to take even longer. So, this would have to be the longest game ever when there are so many other ways for people to come here to the United States and do harm. In fact, I think what we don't recognize is that refugees are in harm's way. So they're the victims, not the perpetrators of harm. And that means even if they're in camps around the country, the average wait, I did not know this until I did research, the average wait for people who live in camps around the world is 26 years, literally an entire lifetime for so many people. And most of them don't even get resettled. Sometimes they just go back to conflict zones because they're tired of staying in these refugee camps. So the danger is to them. They are not a danger to us.
Right. Well, first of all, as a white male, I feel personally attacked. That's my feelings are the most important thing here.
It was just for you. I was targeted to you.
Right. No, but actually, if you think about it, it's pretty impressive. It would almost be impossible for a group after 40 years to have a perfect record of non-terrorism. I mean, every other group you could think of, U.S.-born citizens or, like you said, tourists or student visas, every other group has at least someone that really speaks to the vetting process. But yeah, I tend to agree with you. The wait shouldn't be so long. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah.
You should get these people living their lives and resettled. Well, again, Jessica Goudeau. Am I saying it right?
You're saying it just right.
Perfect. The book is After the Last Border. And Matthew has COVID, apparently. He's been coughing this whole time, but we'll take those out. Or maybe we'll do a super cut of all the coughs at the end. People should definitely check out the book. And we really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks. This was a great conversation.
All right.
Thank you,
have a good day.
I'm really enjoying the book. And thank you for writing it. And thank you for coming to talk to us about it.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me.